It was almost midnight when the sound started. First, a low so faint it seemed like a trick of my tired mind. Soon, it evolved into something more distinct, like irregular tapping, always muffled, coming from the trunk. It shouldn't be anything. Or that's what I kept telling myself. The road was long and straight, a dark asphalt strip cutting through the cornfields of Van Meter, Iowa. The headlight of our old Chevrolet illuminated just enough to make the emptiness ahead feel even more oppressive. "Do you want to stop and check?" Sarah, my wife, asked in a tone that seemed to be testing for skepticism. I wanted to say no, but Sarah had one of those voices that prompted action, even from someone already on the edge of despair. I sighed and pulled the car over to the shoulder. Van Meter wasn't the kind of place where anything happened. It was the type of town where people left their doors unlocked and still believed the worst danger was the lack of rain. But still, something about that night, or maybe about that sound, kept me on edge. "What do you think it is?" Sarah asked, crossing her arms to protect herself from the cold. The wind that passed between the fields seemed to whisper something I couldn't understand. "Probably something loose, banging against the metal," I replied. It sounded practical, just the way I wanted it to. But it wasn't the truth. There was a tension in the air, something that stuck to the skin like the humidity of a muggy day. I got out of the car. The flashlight from my phone wasn't enough to light much beyond the body of the car. When I opened the trunk, I expected to find a poorly stacked box or a forgotten tool. Instead, there was only emptiness. Nothing that could have made that sound. Sarah leaned over my shoulder. "Is everything okay in there?" I was about to say yes, but the sound returned, except now it wasn't coming from the trunk. It was closer. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Sarah stared at me, narrowing her eyes. "Hear what?" That's when I realized I was sweating, even with the cold wind cutting through the field. Sarah had always been practical, sometimes to a fault. She wasn't the type to believe in things she couldn't see, touch, or explain. The kind of person who kept everything in its place and thought life should follow that same logic. I was the opposite. Maybe that's why she'd insisted I deal with the noise, because deep down, she thought I would turn a simple problem into something bigger, as I always did. I liked driving at night. The world felt smaller, as though the darkness around us turned the road into an endless tunnel. But that night, the usual comfort of silence was replaced by something heavier. A weight I'd been feeling since we left home. As we headed back to the car, I looked at the cornfields surrounding the road. They were tall, taller than I remembered, like living walls hiding something. The wind kept blowing, but now it felt like it was carrying something with it, a sensation that wasn't just mine. "There's nothing back there," I said, getting back into the car. Sarah gave me that look that said, "Of course, there's nothing. You're just tired. Stop imagining things." She turned on the radio. A monotone voice from the announcer was talking about a storm that might arrive the next morning. Sarah adjusted the volume, but the sound was still there. Now it was clearer. No longer a tap-tap. It was something heavier, irregular, like long nails scraping wood. "Again?" Sarah murmured, irritated. This time, I didn't stop. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to convince myself everything was fine. But Sarah started shifting in her seat, restless. She was listening now. "Maybe it's something in the engine," I suggested, my voice forced to sound normal. Sarah shook her head slowly. "It's not coming from the engine," she said. And then, after a long silence, she added, "It's coming from inside. The word stuck to me like a thorn. Not the engine, not the trunk. Inside. The acceleration of the car seemed to match the beating of my heart. The sound persisted, like a shadow you feel without seeing. The kind of thing that seems smaller when you try to ignore it, but grows in the corner of your mind when the silence returns. Sarah and I didn't argue much, but that night seemed determined to change that. "If it's so important, pull over and check again," she said. Her voice was as dry and cutting as the noise in the trunk. "I've already looked," I replied, but my tone wasn't as firm as I wanted. She crossed her arms and stared ahead. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than any shout. I kept driving, but my mind was split. Part of me wanted to pull over again, prove everything was fine. Another part knew it wasn't. The sound changed. No more scratching, but rhythmic banging, like something inside was trying to get out. Sarah sat up straighter. "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly, not taking my eyes off the road. "I heard it, then stopped the car. I didn't want to stop." The lights on the road seemed dimmer, the darkness around us heavier. The thought of getting out of the car to open the trunk now felt like an invitation to something I didn't want to face. "It's fine," I said, trying to convince myself more than her. "It's not fine," she shot back, her voice trembling for the first time. A stronger thud shook the car, making the steering wheel vibrate in my hands. Sarah gasped, clutching the dashboard. "That came from here." I stopped. There was no choice. The car was silent for a moment, the engine still humming. Sarah looked at me, and for the first time that night, I saw something I rarely saw in her: fear. "You go," she said, her eyes fixed on the trunk. I grabbed my phone to use the flashlight, but my hands were sweaty. When I stepped out, the wind seemed to have stopped. The world around me was still, except for one thing: the sound. Heavy steps. I took a deep breath and reached for the trunk. The last thud came before I could open it. The trunk lifted with a long squeal, like a mechanical groan that echoed through the empty night. Sarah was partly leaning out of the car, her eyes shining in the darkness, focused on me. The trunk was empty. Nothing. No object out of place. Just the spare tire, the jack, and the tool kit, all still as they should be. But that silence, that damned silence. "Empty," I said, my voice not sounding like mine. Sarah got out of the car, looking over my shoulder. She examined the trunk more closely than I had, as if expecting something to be hidden in a corner, or perhaps even behind the lining. "Do you hear that?" she asked, whispering as if the night itself was listening. I was about to say there was no sound, but then I heard it. It was back, like a murmur, not from the trunk, but from inside the car. Sarah stepped back, her arms crossed tightly as if trying to shield herself. "It's coming from the back seats now," I almost choked. The car was empty, just the two of us. I knew that. But that sound, soft scratching, the kind you hear when something small, something alive, moves slowly. "This is impossible," I said. But the phrase had no strength, no conviction. "Look, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny." Sarah was trying to sound angry, but there was a crack in her voice. I walked to the back door. Each step felt heavier, like something in gravity had changed. With the flashlight trembling in my hand, I leaned down and pulled the handle. Nothing in there. But the sound was louder now. It was as if it was somewhere between the car's roof and the lining, trapped in the metal, an invisible being crawling through the bones of the vehicle. I slammed the door shut, and Sarah jumped. We looked at each other. "This isn't normal," she murmured, and I could only nod. When we got back inside, the headlights illuminated something that hadn't been there before. A shadow moving along the deserted road, heading in the direction we were driving. I hesitated before starting the car again, my hands firm on the wheel as my eyes stayed fixed on the road. Sarah was quiet, but her restless fingers tapped on the dashboard. "You saw that, didn't you?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. I saw it. My voice was short. No room for doubts. But I don't know what it was. She turned in her seat, looking out the back window, as if waiting for the thing, whatever it was, to reappear. It wasn't just a shadow. It was moving. I started the engine, and the headlights lit up the road again. That uncomfortable silence returned as we moved forward slowly. But the tension was palpable, an invisible weight that seemed to fill the car. A few yards ahead, the road curved gently, and that's when the sound came back. It wasn't from the trunk or the back seats anymore. This time, it was coming from underneath the car. A dry thud. Then another, like something was being dragged or stuck. "Stop the car," Sarah whispered, but the intensity in her voice sounded almost like an order. I pulled over to the shoulder, my heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, but this time, Sarah didn't follow. "Don't get out of the car," she begged, but I was already outside. The flashlight flickered as I crouched beside the vehicle. I looked underneath. There was something there. At first, it was small, an indistinct mass stuck to the chassis. But as the light reached it fully, I realized it wasn't just a thing. It was a hand. A pale, bony hand, disappearing into an impossible shadow. I gasped and stumbled backward, falling onto the gravel. The sound of something scratching the metal started again, this time more frantic, like nails scraping, trying to break free. "There's someone there," I shouted, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. Sarah opened the passenger door and shouted my name, but her voice sounded distant, muffled. Before I could react, the hand disappeared. It didn't slide away, it simply wasn't there anymore, as if it had never existed. Then, from the trunk, came a new sound. A soft, childlike, terrifying laugh. I staggered back to the car, my legs shaking, the sound of the laugh still echoing in my ears like a distant buzz. Sarah was sitting upright in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the edge of the seat, her eyes windows to a terror I could see mirrored in my own. "I heard it," she said before I could say anything. It wasn't my imagination. I heard it. I started the engine and accelerated, leaving the road behind. The sound of the engine was a fragile comfort, a pathetic attempt to drown out the feeling that something was with us. "We need to get out of here," Sarah insisted, almost shouting. "Where to, Sarah?" I shot back, my knuckles white on the wheel. "We're in the middle of nowhere." She didn't answer, but kept glancing behind us, as if something was going to leap into the back seat at any moment. The miles passed in a blur, but the feeling of being watched didn't subside. Through the rearview mirror, I swear I saw something moving in the back seat, but when I turned around, it was empty. "You're messing with me," I muttered to myself, but Sarah heard. What is it?" I shook my head, trying to sound calm. "Nothing. It's nothing." That's when the radio, which had been off the whole time, turned on by itself. First, static, but then it started playing an old song, muffled and distorted. "Ring Around the Rosie," a child's voice sang, but with the melody wrong, reversed, as if it were being scratched by a broken needle. "Turn it off," Sarah screamed, but the buttons didn't respond. And then, as if the car itself were alive, the doors locked with a sharp click. "We're not alone," I whispered. The music continued, distorted and ghostly, but my mind, fighting panic, clung to what seemed like a logical explanation. I needed to regain control. "It's just a car," I murmured, trying to convince myself. "A broken car. Nothing more. You think this is a mechanical failure?" Sarah shouted, but her voice carried more fear than anger. "I don't know what it is. but I'm not sitting here waiting to find out. I yelled back. With a surge of adrenaline, I forced the gear shift into park and turned off the key. The car sputtered, but the radio kept playing. Without thinking, I opened the door and stepped out. The cold wind of the night hit me, and the music kept following me, now muffled by the car's metal. "You've lost your mind." Sarah screamed behind me, but I was already walking toward the trunk. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking, but something inside me, perhaps a desperate desire for normalcy, pushed me forward. I reached the trunk and stared at the lock. "Whatever it is, I'm ending it now, don't open it," Sarah yelled, rushing toward me. "I need to know," I replied, but the truth was, I already knew. I knew that opening the door meant facing something that shouldn't exist, something that could destroy me. My hands hesitated on the lever, and it was then that the car completely died. The interior lights flickered and went out, and the radio gave way to a silence that felt more threatening than any sound. Then I heard it again. A soft tap, coming from inside. "Don't do it," Sarah begged, tears streaming down her face. I took a deep breath and pulled the lever. The trunk opened slowly, as if the metal itself were resisting my movement. The hinges creaked in protest, echoing in the silent night, and the smell, a horrible, acrid, familiar scent, like rotten meat mixed with something chemical, flooded the air. For a second, I saw nothing. Just the emptiness of the car's interior, dimly lit by the faint light from the nearest lamppost. Then the sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was different. It didn't seem to come from inside the car, but from underneath it. "It can't be," I whispered, not turning to Sarah. She was frozen a few steps behind, a statue paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, the car rocked, as if something huge was moving beneath it. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, while Sarah let out a muffled scream. "It's impossible," she whispered, as if the words were a mantra to push away whatever that was. There it was again. A low guttural sound, something between a growl and a moan, that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Let's get back to the car," Sarah begged. "You think the car is still going to protect us?" I shot back, but my voice sounded weak, almost an echo of my own fears. A new sound started, more intense, the metallic scratching, like nails or claws tearing at the underside of the vehicle. Suddenly, an arm, human, but pale and far too long, with fingers that seemed to go on forever, emerged from under the car, pulling itself out. "Run!" I shouted to Sarah, but before we could react, the eyes appeared in the darkness, bright, hungry, watching us. The arm fully dragged itself out, followed by a body that seemed human, but wasn't. The face, if it could even be called that, was a pale, elongated mask, with no eyes, just black holes where light seemed to die. The teeth, sharp, uneven, protruded from a mouth that opened unnaturally, emitting a sound somewhere between a roar and a laugh. Sarah screamed, but the sound barely escaped her throat before the thing moved. It was too fast. Impossible fast. "Run!" I screamed again, but it was too late. She stumbled as she tried to flee, falling to her knees at the edge of the road. The thing advanced. It didn't walk, it crawled, as if it bent its own body in impossible angles, each movement accompanied by that scratching sound on the asphalt. Without thinking, I grabbed the jack from the trunk and threw it at the creature. The metal hit its shoulder with a dull thud, but it barely reacted. Its empty eyes turned toward me, and I felt the crushing weight of being watched. It was as if my mind were laid bare, every fear, every thought, exposed to that presence. It lunged toward me, and I barely had time to dodge. I fell to the ground, feeling the asphalt tear at my skin. "Sarah," I yelled, but she was motionless, paralyzed by terror. With desperate effort, I reached for the lighter in my jacket pocket. Fire. Maybe it was instinct or madness, but in that moment, it seemed like the only weapon I had. I struck the match and tossed it toward the creature. The flame erupted in a sudden burst, illuminating its grotesque shape as it let out a scream that echoed through the night. It recoiled, but I knew this was far from over. The arm fully emerged, and this time it was clear. It was someone, or something very close to it. The figure was thin, almost skeletal, with gray skin stretched tightly over prominent bones. Its movements were erratic, as if the body wasn't used to moving in that way. Sarah screamed, and the figure reacted to the sound, snapping its head around in a fast, inhuman motion. It began to crawl toward us, dragging its hands in a rough, scraping sound against the asphalt. "Run, Sarah!" I shouted, pulling her away from the road. But she was frozen, paralyzed by terror. With no other choice, I grabbed the car jack that lay next to the vehicle. It was heavy, my hands trembling, but I lifted the makeshift weapon with determination. "Stay back!" I shouted, but the figure didn't stop. There was no sound coming from it, only that grotesque, deliberate movement, as if it were feeding off the fear in the air. It was less than 2 meters away when I took the first swing. The sound of metal striking bone was muffled, but effective. The figure fell to the side, but rose again, as if the pain wasn't enough to stop it. I swung again and again, until it finally stopped. My breath was a roar in my ears, and my hands were covered in something I'd rather not identify. "Are you okay?" I asked Sarah, but she kept staring at the fallen body. Only then did I realize there was a sound coming from the trunk. It wasn't scratching anymore, it was a groan. I opened the trunk with trembling hands and saw something that made me freeze. Inside the trunk, there was a man. Not a monster, not something inhuman, someone real, but they looked like they stepped out of a nightmare. He was so thin that his bones poked out beneath the skin, his eyes deep and unnaturally bright, but still human. He groaned, his dry lips moving as if trying to say something. I couldn't help but take a step back. Sarah, who had finally snapped out of her shock, stood by my side. Who are you?" My voice came out hoarse, almost inaudible. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. When my eyes adjusted to the dimness of the trunk, I noticed details I had ignored in the heat of the moment. The marks on his hands, his bruised wrists, as if he had been tied up for a long time. The faint groan, a word he almost whispered. "Help!" Sarah grabbed my arm. "It's him, the one that was crawling." I shook my head, trying to organize my thoughts. It doesn't make sense. Reality began to align, cold and brutal. The man in the trunk was a victim. Maybe kidnapped, tortured. What had crawled before? Another survivor? Someone trying to escape? Or worse, someone keeping him captive? His groan cut through my thoughts. "She is near." "Who?" I asked, but he passed out before he could answer. The sound of an engine in the distance brought me back to the road. Headlights appeared on the horizon, too fast. "Sarah, we need to get out of here," but it was too late. The headlights came closer, illuminating the scene like a sinister stage. Sarah and I froze. The black car, gleaming under the headlights, stopped abruptly a few meters away. The silence was so thick, I could hear the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. "We need to go now," I whispered, pulling Sarah by the arm. But before we could take more than 2 steps, the car doors opened. 2 men stepped out, both dressed in ordinary clothes, but with something in their posture that screamed danger. One had a scar running across his lower lip. The other held what looked like a crowbar. "You shouldn't have stopped," said the man with the scar. his voice cold and firm. "Look at the mess," said the other, pointing at the open trunk. "You should have just kept driving." Sarah gripped my hand tightly, and I knew she was about to run. But they were fast, faster than either of us could imagine. The man with the crowbar approached, taking firm steps, while the other moved toward the trunk. The silence was broken by a short laugh. "Oh, so you're still alive. Looks like we'll have to take care of this once and for all." Everything became clear in an instant. The man in the trunk wasn't an accident, nor a mystery. It was deliberate. A transport, a delivery, a game that went wrong. "Please," Sarah started, her voice trembling. "We just wanted to help." "You helped," replied the man with the scar, tilting his head. "Now all that's left is for you to forget this." That's when I realized they couldn't let us leave, not after we'd seen all of this. The pressure in my chest was so intense, I could barely breathe. I wanted to run, but something told me there was no escape. Adrenaline took over, and I yanked Sarah by the hand, nearly dragging her. The sound of footsteps behind us grew louder, like death was catching up with us second by second. "No, don't look back," I whispered, pulling Sarah toward the desert stretching out in front of us. The fear on her face was palpable, and I could feel her hand trembling in mine. But then, the sound of the car door slamming shut echoed, and a cold voice cut through the night. "You really think you can escape?" It was the man with the scar. I didn't need to look to know he was coming. Every word he spoke was a weight on my body, preventing me from moving faster. Sarah was breathing heavily, but didn't say a word, as if she knew any attempt to speak could condemn us even more. Suddenly, the sound of a gunshot sliced through the air. The impact was so strong, I felt a wave of heat and pain before I even understood what happened. I looked at Sarah, and the sight of her stumbling, her body collapsing to the side, made my stomach twist. She fell to the ground without a scream, without a groan. I screamed. I shouted her name, but it was useless. The sound of the shot still echoed in my mind. She wasn't moving. There was no life in her face. She was. The men approached, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. I couldn't accept it. I couldn't let this happen, but my legs felt heavy. I couldn't even crouch down to help her. Fear paralyzed me. It was stronger than anything. They surrounded me. "Did you really think you could escape?" said the man with the scar, looking at me with a bored expression. "You should have learned the lesson." I was shoved backward, and I fell to the ground, the impact blurring my vision. I couldn't think clearly anymore. Sarah's face, her death, was the only thing left to me. The sound of footsteps getting closer made me try to react, but it was too late. One of the men crouched beside me, and with a macabre calmness, said, "Now you'll understand what happens to those who see too much." The last sound I heard was something heavy hitting the ground, and then nothing. The story ends with the protagonist becoming just another victim, with no chance of escaping the cruel fate that awaited them, like all those before them. Sarah and he never even had the chance for one last breath of freedom. They were consumed by the same force that devoured everyone else who dared to get too close to that unfathomable evil. The end.